Continuing talking about the history of the student debt crisis, second video. So if you haven't seen the first one, kind of explaining the nature of the problem, you may want to look at that. But this time I'm going to look at more specific interventions into the education system that gave us the student debt crisis that we have today. So 1965, it could start earlier. I would like to add a section in here on Eisenhower, because he really started these things, not him necessarily as an individual, but during his presidential administration. He started investing in education, but it was more military men. And then during the Johnson administration, which we're going to look at, came the 1965 Higher Education Act, which the belief prevailed that higher education was a safe and worthy investment. And in a sense, I'm not questioning whether or not education can be, that qualification can be an investment, but it's not always an investment. It's not always a worthy investment. It's definitely not one worth going into debt for, in my opinion. But the prevailing wisdom was that if you invest in education, you're always going to get a return on that investment. And that's not necessarily true. That's even one of the things that people need to look into when going to college is, am I going to get a return? Is the money that I'm going to spend to pay for college going to be worth it because I'm going to get back a greater return on that investment? Am I going to get a greater benefit than my cost? But this was just the idea that if people had higher education, that was always a safe investment because the economy of America would benefit from this. And that's true and valid as far as it goes. So President Lyndon Johnson, not as an individual necessarily by himself, but his administration during his time, desired to extend educational opportunities to the poor. And this made sense. It had good intentions behind it. But his idea was to not just extend it to some men who had been in the military, who had maybe other opportunities otherwise anyway. He wanted to extend these things to the poor, to minorities, to people who wouldn't normally have the opportunity for higher education. Now, that sounds great. Most programs like this sound great and have good intentions. But one of the principles of economics is that intentions do not match results. Economics looks at consequences, and not just immediate consequences, but far-reaching consequences, and how these things affect and have kind of a ripple effect beyond the immediate situation. But the problem, as I mentioned in the previous video, is banks were reluctant to give loans to students who were risky prospects, meaning that there were people who were less likely, according to the measures of the banks, not necessarily individuals. Banks don't know individuals. So what banks look at is data points, looking at, is this individual, is this company likely to pay back the money that they borrow from the bank at interest? Because that's the only motivation for the bank to lend the money out in the first place, is this person going to be a good investment? They're looking at return on investment as well. And because they don't know individuals, they look at data points. They look at credit score. They look at a bunch of different things. If people have been making payments, if they have a pool of savings, if they have a plan, if they have, all kinds of these different things. Now, we could say whether that's fair, unfair, doesn't matter. That's the situation. So the Higher Education Act, the 1965 Higher Education Act, had the government, taxpayers, guarantee the loans. This was to incentivize. This was to give banks a reason, to incentivize banks to loan more money out. more money than they otherwise would be willing to loan. Think about this. Someone comes to you, just as an individual, asks to borrow money. Now they say, what's in it for you in loaning me money is I will pay the money back. Oh, that's not really an incentive to have you give them money necessarily. It may be unless it's a charitable loan. But they say, okay, I'll pay you more money back than I borrowed in the future. So if you say, okay, well, I can hold off consumption now, wait to the future and get more money, it might be worth it for me. But what you're going to look at is whether or not that person's likely to pay it back. That being said, if someone came along and said, hey, I'll make you a deal. If they pay you back, you get the money back plus the interest. And if they don't pay you back, it'll be taken care of. Meaning you won't have to deal with the loss of money, income, investment. It'll be taken care of. That's what the government did to the banks. They said if you can loan out as much as you want to whoever, whenever, for any amount, 17, 18-year-olds going to college who have no likelihood of paying back the loan, who don't even know what they want to do. That's not a slide on 17, 18-year-olds. It's just typical for their age. That's fine. But give them tens of thousands of dollars of money in loans that they have to pay back. Allow them to go into huge amounts of debt. They can't even, well, you used to be able to, we can't even smoke cigarettes. Can't even drink, 21, like I guess it's back in 65. But my point is, they're taking out loans for an investment that would only be appropriate for buying an asset like a house. And so this act encouraged banks to continue to loan and loan and loan out money, and encouraged people to take on more and more and more debt because now they could get loans that they couldn't otherwise get in order to go to school. And the banks were able to be less responsible. The government subsidized their irresponsibility. It subsidized their errors in judgment. It subsidized their risky loans by taking care of it if people defaulted. And over the next 10 years, according to one Forbes article, about 40% of Americans who have student loan debt will default. And when it said the government will take care of it, that's a euphemistic way of saying that the taxpayers will take care of the bill. So the taxpayers are paying for education in a sense, one way or the other. And in this system, even though students default, the student is still in tremendous debt. And so this act shifted almost all the risk to the government, that is the taxpayers. And this didn't mean that the US government said, or the Congress said to the people, we're going to level with you. We are going to tax you in order to pay for education for other people, or for you to make these loans, whatever the case may be. Okay, I mean, some politicians may say that now, but that's the point is they didn't say that. They just either print it or they borrow it. And so this caused the US government to be strung out on debt. This encouraged businesses to be strung out on loans and debt, and individuals. Contributes to the system of debt we have today, where people can't even survive a couple weeks. Businesses can't even survive a couple weeks because they don't have any savings. It's all a debt-ridden economy. But anyway, this act shifted almost all the risk to the taxpayer. So banks could make loans and they could only benefit. They would have no negative consequences for loans that were not paid back. So this privatized profits and it socialized losses. It privatized profits and it socialized losses. Okay, this is called capitalism. This is, and that's not a slur. It's a putting together of two words. It's called crony capitalism. It's taking the it's a soft way of nationalizing an economy. It's that the government takes on via the taxpayer all the risks and encourages certain practices within the business community and benefits the wealthy, the special interests, and they work together as very comfortable friends. Now, a lot of people think, well, we're going to take on Wall Street or we're going to take on the government. A lot of times, these entities are working together. So, a lot of times people think, well, I'm going to side with one against the other, when in actuality, both of them side against you. And so, is this a system that we really want to give more power to? But anyway, so this is the 1965 Higher Education Act. This creates a flood of more people going to college. The Economist, and this shows that not all quote unquote economists or people with degrees in economics understand or follow basic principles of economics. They get so focused down on one specific area of economics that they forget basic principles. But anyway, Alice Rivlin, who I believe is still alive, or was alive last year, she headed the Johnson administration's student loan task force. Later, she would be the first head of the Congressional Budget Office for Bill Clinton's, and then Bill Clinton's top budget official when he was president and the vice chair of the Federal Reserve. So this is a very well-known economist, a very politically active economist. And she talked about the switch of direct aid to students. Okay, so now the students would be given direct aid through the banks, subsidized by the federal government. And she writes, it evolved, or said at the time, it evolved into almost a fixation among economists anyway, with the idea that higher education added to your future income. Therefore, loan finance was a sensible thing. You could pay it back with your future income. You could pay, companies can borrow to buy equipment. People ought to be able to borrow to invest in themselves. Well, that last sentence is something very common that we hear, and it makes sense as far as it goes in a general way. But she talks about how this idea of investing through taking out loans to go to college at any cost became sort of the norm of thinking in America, the norm of thinking in economists that were government employed economists to come up with these plans, and that investing in education was always a good idea. But like I said, you have to look at the return on investment. Investing $250,000 to become a teacher, which is my job, and being under that tremendous loan burden and debt burden is not worth it. It's not worth it to pay for the college and credential programs to do that. Now, maybe if you're going to business, but remember, students don't always even finish, right? Even if someone says they're going to be an engineer and then they go for 2 years and don't finish, it's not an investment that they're getting a return on. So the idea is, yes, with my future income, I'll be able to pay off the money I borrowed to pay to go to school. But it's not necessarily, we don't know what the future is going to be. That's the point. There's uncertainty with that. And so this idea that it's the same thing as buying equipment for a company, no, it's not. Because buying computers for a business, that is capital investment, making the business more cost effective, more efficient, more productive. We know at some level exactly what a computer is going to bring to a business. We don't know when someone's investing or borrowing to invest in their education exactly how that's going to pay off. And so it's not the same thing as capital investment, even though many people would like to think it's a one-to-one correspondence. Now, it's not to say education's not an investment or never an investment, but this idea that it's always an investment and that college is necessary at any cost, or that it's always worth paying whatever you have to for college, wherever you want to go, whatever they're asking for, not looking at other options, not saying other options as far as go to college, not go to college, not always a binary, but the other options of how to pay for college and college choice and what your return on investment is going to be. And this is not, by the way, a left versus right thing, a Democrat versus Republican thing. Eisenhower was a Republican. Johnson was a Democrat. Now Nixon, again, is another Republican. This is not a left versus right issue. This is an issue of something that's been caused since really the late 1950s, early 1960s, through these interventions into the system, making education, weighing it down with these burdens that make it more monopolistic, less competitive, less rigorous, all these kinds of problems, and filling people with all kinds of debt. So it's a bipartisan problem that has been laden on generations of Americans, and we should hold the parties involved responsible. But both sides, I don't think, really have a full grasp of the nature of the problem. This is why we need to understand the history behind these things. So the Rivlin report from Alice Rivlin came out in 1969. Around 1972, what we're going to look at, came the Higher Education Act of 1972 under the Nixon administration. The act made permanent the government role in guaranteeing student loans made by private banks. Again, this is called capitalism, crony capitalism. The Higher Education Act of 1972 locked in the government role guaranteeing student loans made by private banks. So private banks could only win by making loans. They could never lose. Now I want you to think, if you had a credit card that you could spend on and you could only get the benefits of your purchases, never have to pay the bill, that would create an incentive. It would create a moral hazard in economics in the sense that we would act in a way that we wouldn't normally act. This other institution still around today, Sallie Mae, it's a banking institution, a quasi-public entity to jumpstart the loan market. Now, what Sallie Mae did, Sallie Mae is kind of like a bank, kind of like a government private bank, that what it did in order to continue the system going is now that these banks are making out a lot more of these loans, what Sallie Mae started doing was buying up the loans from the banks and then loaning them out and kind of acting as a banking institution in its own right and having its own set of loans that would give out to people. So it borrowed directly. Sallie Mae had a benefit that other businesses and individuals don't have. They could borrow money directly from the U.S. Treasury at a very low rate. They could borrow money from the U.S. Treasury at a very low rate. So they get a privileged position to borrow from the US Treasury at a deal. And so they used the money to buy these student loans from the banks so that the banks could make even more loans. So the banks make all these loans, Sallie Mae purchases them up so that the banks could make even more. And so more students are taking out more loans, lading themselves with more and more debt to go to college. And now, oh, and by the way, this is a discussion for another time. And not to say this is what every student does, but a lot of times people take out loans today to fund not the expenses of college itself. They may fund that, but also to fund their lifestyle while they're in college. Pay for, there are necessary things. I get that, clothing, shoes, I understand. But paying for things like going out to eat, paying for a certain lifestyle, a standard of living with debt. It's like having a very high limit credit card in a sense to use student loans for those purposes. But anyway, this is what Sallie Mae started doing, brought in by the Higher Education Act of 1972, signed in by the Nixon administration. Now, government spending from that time on education has only increased. So they talk about, well, we don't spend enough on education. Well, there's a lot of government spending on education. So it may not have the results people want. It may not be the amounts people want. But the reality is there's been a huge amount of spending. But here's the ironic thing. You'd think more spending means a decrease in prices. If the government's spending so much on education, on healthcare, on all these other areas, why are we still paying so much? Why are the costs going up? Why are the prices going up? Well, here's what happens. As the money gets spent, loaned out, and starts to subsidize something, the rule in economics, or a rule in economics, is what you subsidize tends to increase and what you tax tends to decrease. So let me give you an example of the latter. When you tax cigarettes, the goal is that people will smoke less. When you tax gas, the goal is that people will use less gas. That's the goal, and sometimes it's an unintended goal. That's not always the rule with the tax, or the goal with the tax, but it is kind of the rule. The opposite is true as well. If people gave you more money in order to do something, you would probably do more of that thing than you otherwise would. For example, let's say that you were all of a sudden given an extra $100 for groceries. Okay, we're not talking, this is just imaginary, but let's say it just came from some source. Okay, a bunch of people all of a sudden given $100 extra for groceries that they didn't otherwise have. They would tend to buy more groceries, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if you have an extra $100. But if a bunch of people do that at the same time, you have a lot more people going and buying groceries. Okay, same thing with student loans in colleges. They subsidize student loans. The banks loaned out all this money. We have way more people taking out loans and way more people going to college. Well, that sounds good, but the reality is they increased demand, more people wanting college without increased supply. Increased demand, more people going to college without increased supply, more college. So when there's an increased demand without an increased supply, more people wanting something than that than the commodity, whatever it is, good or service that's wanted, the price will rise to meet demand. See that? So more people all of a sudden flushed with more debt, more money in order to pay for college, same amount of college, prices rise to meet the demand. So this is why we have more government spending, more debt to pay for college than ever before, and yet an astronomical increase in prices. And there's not a free market in colleges in the sense that it's not as easy to open up more colleges, to hire more people, to teach more classes, all that stuff. The incentives are not there to do that. And so the prices will continue to rise, people will continue to be in debt, and the taxpayers will continue to foot the bill, whatever that expression is. So there's more open access to loans, higher education, without more supply. And so the incentive to college is to maximize tuition, to increase fees and enrollment costs, as they to create, rock climbing walls, cool gyms, all these other kinds of things to attract students in and advertise, which there's nothing wrong with advertising in general, but with this system, you can kind of see the irony here in the sense of, well, shouldn't they pay for more teachers to teach basic classes that people need? No, we'll do a rock climbing wall because that will bring in more students. Because students aren't necessarily going to go take Math 110. They're not going to be brought in by that. But by a rock climbing wall, a cool gym, restaurants, a lazy river, these are all real things at colleges. And as these things get paid for, there's more administrators being paid to manage the system. And there's nothing wrong with these people. They're not good or bad people one way or the other in the sense of economically. They're just people working a job. But it layers on more cost to the system because they are now added to this, which adds another layer of bureaucracy within schools. It makes it more difficult to talk to people, the right people, to find out what you need, all these things. Okay? They also relaxed admission standards to get more people to come in and pay them the prices that they were asking, that now all of a sudden these people are able to pay through this loan debt. They relaxed their admission standards. So colleges allowed people in on the idea that this person is going to be able to handle college. They're going to be able to handle the rigor of our standards and all these types of things. And that may be fair or unfair based on their criteria. But remember, they don't know you as an individual. So they have to look at data points. What did this person get on the SAT? What was this person, maybe entry essay or whatever the case may be. But now with this system, colleges are incentivized to lower their standards for admission, just to receive the money from the students, not necessarily to give them an education. Because now they don't care. I don't mean individuals, but in this terms of incentives, there's not as much of a reason to care whether or not students graduate. It's just whether they come in and they're paying the tuition and paying the fees. This also allows for professors to kind of just teach whatever they want, whether it's a legitimate field of study or not, or just something that the professor is interested in, right? And that's a different topic for a different time. But easy money led to an increase in college students, leading to higher prices. That's it in a sentence. Congress increased, by the way, loan limits. So throughout all this process, Congress opens it up even more, increases even more the limits to which people can borrow. They expand the program even more. So Sallie Mae, banks, and schools, they collect more profits, and any losses paid for by the government, by the taxpayers. We didn't think about dropouts, was one economist, I believe economist Mundell, who was behind some of the planning for these things. They didn't account for the fact that first-time college students entering into college, a college environment for their first time in their life, maybe the first ones in their family, taking out huge amounts of debt to pay for school, relaxing admission standards to get into the school, and then, not to mention students taking out as much debt as they want at 17, 18 years old to get a degree in whatever. They didn't account for the fact that a lot of those students would not finish. This is why, as I say, economists have to look at not just the intentions, not just the immediate results, but they have to think about the long-term consequences of these things based on economic principles. Funding students with loans without accounting for the possibility of dropouts. This created perverse incentives. This created incentives that would not have otherwise been there, that are good for nobody involved. Colleges could raise money quickly by admitting students with no consequences if the students did not finish or defaulted on loans. Hear that. Colleges could raise the money. They could get all the fees, enrollment fees, tuition costs, all the fees that somebody pays when they join school, because it's being paid for. And if 50% don't finish, that's pretty good for a college. Now, if you or I get 50% on a test, that's called failing a test. But for colleges, if 50% of their students pass with a degree within 4+ years, that is considered a victory and unusually successful. The colleges have no blight on their record if students don't finish. And the banks have no consequences if students don't pay their loans because they're federally insured. These are perverse incentives. So if a student does not finish, the loan still has to be paid. Now, here's the thing. Even if a student defaults on their loan, it doesn't mean that the debt burden for them goes away, because there was a law written, I don't remember exactly when, but it was a federal law that if you default, if you go into bankruptcy, it's literally saying to your creditors, I don't have anything. Look, it's like Michael Scott, I declare bankruptcy. I don't have anything. There's nothing for you to even come and take. You could sue me, but you're not going to get anything. And after a process of bankruptcy that destroys credit, all this stuff, that you go through it, and it levels out it brings it back to a level of normalcy. Sad. It's very damaging, but it goes through it. But you can't do that with student loans. Even if a student does not finish, even if the taxpayers have to pay it, if a student defaults, even if the colleges have no consequences for a student not finishing their program, the student is still laden with the burden of debt. They still have to pay it off, and it has very likely an increasing interest rate for lack of payment. The recession in 2007-2008, which is topic in and of itself, but I'm not going to talk to what uh, caused that, except to say that it was the easy money and easy banking policies here. It wasn't deregulation. Okay, that's a myth. Uh, there was plenty of regulation. It wasn't that the Clinton deregulated things in the 90s, and that was the problem, the cause of these things. No, the bubble created and spread through the economy was created through artificial credits, artificial interest rates that caused companies to make decisions that they wouldn't have otherwise made with easy money, going to huge amounts of debt that they couldn't pay, and there was a huge recession. And in 2020, in our situation presently, we may go through one again. There is another one coming. There is a bubble, and it may be as great or even greater than the recession of 2007, 2008. But this was the situation into which President Obama was elected. So during this time, there's a boom in college and graduate school enrollment. A lot of people lost their jobs, or they're uncertain about their jobs, were wanting to move forward. So they started going back to school. Okay, neither good nor bad in and of itself. But the Obama administration tried to increase regulation on the system. Okay, Obama recognized some of these problems, even mentioned some of these things on the campaign trail, but it continued under the assumption that college is always a safe investment. So they're still following the same presuppositions. Now, Obama said when he became president, every American will need to get more than a high school diploma. Okay, so it's a message from the president himself that college is necessary in that sense, and it's always a necessary investment. So Obama cut out the guaranteed student loan program to put in place a direct program. When I say Obama, I don't mean as an individual. I mean the time during his administration, all the government actors during this time. We're just identifying it with Obama as one of the responsible actors whose name is tied with this time period. Okay. Now, money came directly for the direct loan program. Money came directly from the U.S. Treasury. And what got encouraged during this time was income-based repayment programs, meaning you would repay based on the amount of money that you were making. Okay. The problem with this is that it finally cut. It severed that last link between the value of a particular degree and how much one could borrow. There's often a big mistake that people, well-meaning people, make all the time. And if you're a teacher, a parent, or a counselor, you may have made this mistake, but you need to stop and you need to change it. And here's the mistake people make. In my hand here, we're going to do a law of averages. Okay, and I'm going to split it in two. We have people here in the United States. And now we're going to disaggregate two groups. And we're going to look at the law of averages. In this hand, I hold all the people who have a college degree. In this hand, I have people who do not have a college degree. People who have a college degree, people who don't have a college degree. Now, if we look at, this is the mistake many well-meaning people have made, so pay attention. If we look at the hand that has all the people with the college degree and the hand of the people who don't have a college degree, on average, which group on average makes more money, makes more income over a lifetime? And most people know the answer because this is how it's been put to them. The people with the college degree, on average, over a lifetime, make more money. That's true as far as it goes. The non sequitur, the thing that does not follow from that, is that therefore you must do college, any degree, at any cost. and you will guarantee yourself a greater income than if you did not go to college. That's a mistake. What we need to do is take this hand, okay, and now I'm going to split this group into two. We're going to disaggregate it. We're going to spread it out. We're looking at just people now who went to college. Is the amount borrowed, the amount paid for an education, the amount spent on college, and the return on investment that people get from going to college and then the income that they make later on after college, is it the same for all the people in the group who went to college within a general average? No, it is not. There is a difference. And I'm not talking about difference in personal value. I'm talking about recognizing a real difference in income between degrees. There's a difference on average between a business degree and a humanities degree. There is a difference between a business degree and an art degree. There is a difference between an engineering degree and a philosophy degree. There are differences on average. So it's not good to say to people entering college or thinking about entering college, it's not good to put on them the pressure of it's just a binary of college versus no college. What we need to tell students, what we need to tell people, and what people need to hear and tell themselves is the question is not college versus no college. It's does what I want to major in college and the field I want to work in, what is the average that someone starting in that field makes? And that's not a justification for debt, but that now you're talking real numbers. If your degree is an engineering degree, you can think, okay, is it worth it for me to pay this amount over 4 years in order to get an engineering degree? If your degree is an art degree and you're planning on having a certain job as an artist, is the amount of income I'm going to make greater than the amount of money I'm going to spend in order to do it? There is a difference between, not qualitatively, though that could be an argument, but that's not my point. There is a difference, not qualitatively, between degrees, but in terms of quantity of amount of income that somebody's going to make. So the question is not college versus no college. The question is whether or not it is worth it to pay what you're planning to pay for college to work in the job that you want to work in. Are you going to get a return on investment? Now you're talking in cost benefit analysis. Is the cost I'm going to give up to do this going to be less than the benefit I'm going to receive because I did this? The problem here happened during the Obama administration was that these income-based repayment programs sound fine in the sense that, okay, well, people who are making greater incomes or less incomes will be able to pay based on that basis. We could debate the philosophy of that. But the thing with that is it severed the link between any particular degree and how much one could borrow. So now people could borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars for a teaching credential, which I'm a teacher. I'm not bashing it, for an art degree, as well as for engineering, math, those other things, business, that are higher paid fields. And your worth is not necessarily tied to your income, but that's not the point. The point is, are you going to be able to, is it really worth it in the sense of paying what you're paying to get what you're going to get in your degree field? And so this caused our present situation today, that we have huge amounts of debt and easy money by the government, ladening the taxpayers with debt, printing money, causing inflation, burdening our country with huge amounts of government debt, which to me, this economics is supposed to be value free, but is taxation without representation. This is debt on children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. This is a tax on the unborn. Inflation is a tax on the poor and the middle class, on their savings. It's a tax on our money without us noticing. Backing banks to make these risky loans, privatizing their costs and socializing their losses, ladening generations, now plural, generations with huge amounts of student debt that is, in many senses, I'm not going to say is unpayable, because in a reality, if you have student debt, you've got to be aggressive and make a plan to pay it off, because in a sense, this is the system that was created by this. No one's coming to save you, and it would be nice kind of if they did, but you can't depend on that and wait around 15, 20 years for that. But the people who created the system in the first place, some of them dead, some of them alive, I mean, the proposals for this have been bipartisan. It's how much faith do you have that some panacea solution is going to fix this for you? And it may be unfair to allow a 17, 18-year-old to take out thousands of dollars of debt to go to college. I hear that. And then colleges being flooded with demand, holding monopolistic privileges, not increasing supply, and then the prices shooting up 1,375% since the 1960s. This has created a huge mess. These were the interventions, and there's more to this, and it's more complex, but this is the basics that we need to know. This has created a huge disaster for Americans. And so my advice is refuse to be a part of it. Do not borrow in order to go to school. Do not enter this system. And if you have, sorry, but it's time to get aggressive about getting out of debt and paying it off. It's unfair. It sucks. It's not fun. It's going to take sacrifices, but rather sacrifice now to get it cleared up and over with than to continue to sacrifice your present and future to student loan payments. The economist Alice Rivlin, who worked for the Johnson administration, who produced the Rivlin report in '69 and that was used by the Nixon administration in the '70s, she was asked in 2019 about this system that she helped create over 50 years ago. Her response and her analysis was, "We unleashed a monster."